for 50, 60 years, been pumping CO2 under the ground to get more oil and gas out. That's a little bit oxymoronic for what we're trying to do now in terms of fossil fuels. Companies like ourselves are now saying reuse it's sort of like, really, isn't that just obvious that it makes much more sense to do something with that CO2?
Welcome back to the Decarb Connect podcast. I am very happy to be joined by Martin Keighley from CarbonFree, their chief executive, who I have just discovered today is a British person by stealth living in San Antonio. I think that's right, isn't it, Martin?
It is, yes.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us. We're going to be having a conversation partly about CarbonFree and the CO2 reuse technology that they have developed, but also more broadly about the CO2 reuse market. Martin is coming with an embarrassment of experience in this space, from being CEO of Tata Chemicals in the US to a very active advisor and board member, and has now been leading the charge at CarbonFree. It looks like you're coming up for your fourth anniversary sometime soon.
I am. It's shocking, yeah.
Well, let's start, as I normally do, with my classic lazy podcaster's question, which is, can you give a little bit of a sense of how you've arrived at this point in time? You know, I've hinted at your background in chemicals, but, you know, you've still made this decision at some point to come into the decarbonisation space, into this particular aspect of CO2 reuse. Can you paint a picture of how professionally and personally you've got there? And then we'll talk a bit more about CarbonFree.
Great, absolutely, yeah. I'm delighted to be talking to you, Alex. Yeah, so I'm a chemical engineer originally by background. I spent most of my career in industrial chemicals, so large manufacturing space, so very aware of energy and emissions. Not so much really about CO2, probably, to be honest, for most of the last 30 years. Spent a little bit of time in clean tech and the water technology, and then most recently in large mining and chemicals operations here in the US with Tata Chemicals. And then I really wanted to move back into clean tech, and really climate tech is the biggest challenge we have of the day. And so CarbonFree was a perfect coming together for me of, we're a chemicals business, we're a disruptive chemicals business, making chemicals a different way, carbon neutral chemicals, and we're capturing CO2 to do that. So it was a perfect combination of sort of everything I'd done up to this point, really.
And tell me a bit about that move from Tata into CarbonFree. I feel like if you were going to pick two extremes in terms of size of company and so forth, how did you navigate that? And are you now used to being back in that kind of scale-up environment?
Yeah, it's interesting because I bounced both ways. I was in a small startup clean tech in the UK, then moved back to Tata and then back again. So there can be frustrations of being in large multinationals. Certainly one of the reasons for that there was a nice segue was one of the things we were doing at Tata a lot was a huge ramp up in interest in decarbonisation. We were one of the early companies looking at internal pricing on carbon. So all future capital projects had to price in essentially the CO2 emission impact. So I was getting very sort of interested in this space. But when you're in a big multinational, things move slowly. Decisions are ultimately, you're always dependent on somebody else. So the move into a early stage startup technology company was just perfect for me, because it put me much more in control, and I felt I could drive things faster. A whole range of other frustrations, but this was an exciting thing, and we've been around for some time. Our original inventor had been working on this for 17, 18 years, so it's not as if it was completely new.
I just want to take this opportunity to thank our production partner and sponsor, Jano Media, for their support in delivering the Decarb Connect podcast. Over the last few years, they've helped us to facilitate great conversations that connect us with our audience, and their skills and expertise mean that we get to concentrate exclusively on generating the content, the conversations that engage, inform, and inspire. Okay, so well, that's a good kind of avenue into understanding a little bit more about the business. So you've mentioned that it's designed to create these carbon neutral chemicals. Can you tell us a little bit more about the origin story, but also where you are at the moment, both in terms of size of team and the types of projects engaged in?
Joe Jones, a Texan from a long line of sort of oil families out sort of west, and he was he started on this 17 or 18 years ago, believing that mineralization was the way forward for CO2. And of course, it wasn't the big problem and issue that's seen as today. But turning them into useful products that would permanently lock up the CO2 was certainly something of a passion of his. We developed our first generation technology, and we have an operating commercial scale plant here in San Antonio, Texas. We capture CO2 from a cement plant, and we make baking soda, sodium bicarbonate. And that's sodium chemistry is a great way of capturing and using CO2. Doesn't quite have the same permanence because you're re-releasing CO2 when you use the baking soda, and quite small global markets. So the application and ability to expand and scale is not huge. So as the interest over the last couple of years has really sort of accelerated and ramped up, we're now focused on our second generation technology, which is calcium and magnesium chemistry. So here we're making calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is limestone. But we're making not sort of cement and aggregate grades. We're making a very high quality calcium carbonate called PCC. And it's used as a filler in paper and paints, plastics, also in food products. It's for indigestion. In the US, they're called Tums. I'm just trying to think what are they called in the UK or Europe, but
Rennies.
Rennies, there we go. Rennies, exactly. Yes. So that's what high purity calcium carbonate is. But it's got a much better pricing position. It's a specialty chemical and a much bigger market than the baking soda. So that's SkyCycle, which is our second generation technology that we're now pushing forward with.
And I know some of the disruptive tech we look at has particular, either to do with its chemistry or the way that it works. It can only work with certain types of CO2 output. What's the story for you? Like, you're obviously have this working example in cement at the moment. What different routes are there?
Great question. One of the real beauties of our technology is it's sort of basic inorganic chemistry. So it's sort of what I call like sort of high school bench chemistry. You add A plus B and make C, and then add C plus B and move to D. So we can really take the flue gas from pretty well any process. We can also take it what I call dirty flue gas, so we can take it untreated, because a lot of industrial flue gases have other contaminants in them. They have SOx and NOx and particulates, particularly very big these days, in terms of the impact that they have, on asthma and other things in sort of local area to factories. We just take that as an untreated gas, raw gas, and we bubble it through a liquid column, and that differentiates us a lot from other technologies which require very specific types of CO2 or pre-treatment or pre-cleaning. And that's what makes us really such a great solution for hard-to-abate the industrial sector.
Mm. Well, the CO2 utilization space, I have to say, I have a bit of a soft spot for, because it feels like we are in the kind of early stages, the foothills, if you like, of what in 30, 40 years is going to be the, well, obviously, market.
Yeah.
So it is new, though. So tell me a bit about, what's your sense of the progress that's been made? What sort of, whether that's in the types of applications or the market in general, the last sort of, 12 to 24 months, what have you seen as some of the kind of major kind of step ups that have been made?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's particularly for your CCU utilization reuse is still very nascent. The way carbon capture, the way the industry and companies have responded to the commitments essentially that have been made. Pretty well every country, every company has now made a carbon net zero commitment. Pretty well everybody has sort of committed that the way they're likely to do that is to capture and store CO2. That was the known, easier solution to latch onto. and it comes very much from the background of the oil recovery days. So for 50, 60 years, been pumping CO2 under the ground to get more oil and gas out. That's a little bit oxymoronic for what we're trying to do now in terms of fossil fuels. But that has sort of created that sort of underground storage tank. So it's quite easy to say, we'll be net zero, we'll put it under the ground. Sort of job done, as long as we get it done by 2050. The reality is that's proving harder to do, and I think there are challenges to that, both in Europe and North America. And therefore, there are companies like ourselves coming out now saying, reuse is to start with, it's just, as you say yourself, it's sort of like, really, isn't that just obvious that it makes much more sense to do something with that CO2? We often forget that we are essentially built on a carbon economy. So, forget the CO2 being part of it. There's so much of what we do has carbon in it, in carbonates or carbon in the building material. So it's just a case of resourcing where we get that carbon from. So we're getting more interest in certainly in utilization. It has a challenge because it's now two steps of technology that people need to get comfortable with. You need to capture, and then there's another whole process to convert it into whatever it is your reused product. So that's a little harder for people to get their head around. It's not a single product that we're making, so it's more of it's a looser, wider industry of technologies. So it's harder to get a single message across. But we're starting to get now some coalitions of CCU companies coming together, and we're leading some of that charge to start to get the education and the messaging out there. But things like certainly in the US, 45Q and the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which increased some of the values there. The EU is currently looking at changes to regulations around giving more credence to utilization and mineralization. And I think as companies are realizing that underground storage isn't maybe the holy grail, or actually any single technology is not the holy grail, we're finding more and more that large emitters are realizing that rather than trying to find the one single magic bullet, what they need to do is think of a portfolio of solutions. So some of the CO2 may go under the ground, some may be converted into calcium carbonate, some may be converted into some other product. So we're getting much more engagement, although still early days.
Yeah, I think interesting to hear about you coming together with some of the other CO2 utilization companies, because it sort of strikes me that one of the reasons it's been slower to take space in people's imagination is just simply it doesn't have that big company PR lobbying kind of background to it. Typically, it is startup companies, early stage, scale up companies. So I think, yes, that makes sense to have that kind of collaborative approach to getting on the agenda. And we're going to turn our attention to the IRA that you mentioned, because I feel like this has probably also played a role in that. So the IRA brought all these changes in. You've mentioned 45Q, which is obviously pre-existing, but that it's sort of built on top of. But there were also sort of some interesting omissions, sorry, or I don't know if that's the right word for it, that definitely affected your sector. So tell us a bit about what worked in the IRA for you, and also, what is now becoming a sort of kind of second strand to this in the Carbon Utilization Parity Act. So yeah, walk us through that.
Yeah, great way of looking at it, actually, Alex. So first of all, 45Q in itself is an interesting instrument that actually was very positive and quite sort of groundbreaking. Again, interestingly, coming originally from that sort of underground storage and enhanced oil recovery play. It has storage and utilization as two different classifications for carbon capture, and has a value per ton linked to it. So the IRA was great because it just put more dollars in. So for utilization, it moved it from $35 a ton to $60 a ton, and for storage from $50 a ton to $85 a ton. So that in itself just puts more money out there. It gets investors a lot more interested in the space. For us, in terms of other things that it did in a positive sense, so maybe talk about the shortfalls. It moved it to a direct pay, certainly for the first period. So it previously was a tax credit, so you had to claim it through a tax mechanism, or find a way to monetize that. It now moves into, certainly for the first 5 years, to a direct pay. So as an earlier stage business, maybe where you're not paying taxes or you don't want the complexity of, certainly in the US, the sort of tax system, you can get a direct. So in our case, CCU, it will be that $60 a ton. It also reduced the size and the way they define some of the emitters projects. So you could basically do smaller projects. I think previously it was 100,000 ton capture plants. It now allows you to go down to smaller plants. That fits well with us. Our sort of starting entry point is around a 50,000 ton capture plant, and it also just improves some mechanisms for trading and transferring credits. On the where there's still a shortfall, and that the broader CCU industry and sort of sector looks at is somewhat nonsensical having this difference between CCU and CCS. So what it's sort of done is it's made CCS look storage more interesting because it's worth more money. So it's sort of just what we were talking about earlier. It sort of incentivized the wrong behavior. Also, we've talked a lot, and the US is a home to solving issues and problems by innovation, and it's got a great track record in that. So we believe that even though you do make money out of CCU products, and we're a little different because we have a pretty highly profitable business model. There are quite a lot of those CCU technologies which require some form of subsidy because they have a higher cost base or things. And also, we've invested a lot of money over the last 18 years researching and developing this. So you need to sort of fund innovation and invention. So that's what subsequently we've been part of supporting the 45Q Parity Act. So essentially it says, make CCU the same as CCS at $85 a ton. And there's some good support for that in Congress. It's logical and makes sense. We just need to keep putting the lobbying pressure on for that.
And that, I think I'm right in saying that's a bipartisan.
It is, yeah.
Support, so that also simplifies its journey somewhat, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think even with it was interesting. The 45, I think, representing that sort of bipartisan field. The 45Q and the IRA increases, they all survived all of the negotiations around the debt ceiling agreement that was made. They all stayed in there. They weren't stripped out in any way. So I think that demonstrates the strong support there is on both sides. I think there is a bigger question now as people start to looking much more heavily at deployment. There's certainly an undercurrent across industries that even at $85 a ton, let's assume we get parity, for the size of the problem that we're trying to solve and to give the right incentives, it probably needs to move up more. And I think that's where you'll see, as well as a Parity Act push, I think you're going to see more and more conversation around what's the next step post the IRA.
Perhaps something more along the lines of what Germany has put on the table.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's come back to the CCU market then. You've talked a little bit about this kind of second generation technology and the products that are coming out of that for you. What alongside that, what other products do you think are really going to lead this kind of CO2 reuse market to really be a kind of more of a kind of global active marketplace? What's going to define that in the next 10, 15 years, do you think?
I think anything where we need sources of carbon, we have to reinvent those and actually take those. I think one of the things that there has to be an acceptance of, and there's still a challenge in carbon capture, we have removal and reduction. Removal is creating a significant groundswell. Direct air capture is capturing the imagination of quite a few people and investors. On the reduction side, in some areas there's an assumption that we will just stop emitting altogether. The reality is, I'm sorry, but I think that's not a credible way forward, even by 2050. We can reinvent and we can come up with new technologies to manufacture some of these key products that we need. Steel, cement, plastics, glass. The world can't just suddenly do without these products, and they're a fundamental part of the fabric of what we do. But also, there's massive invested capital in these facilities, and jobs. So we're partnering with US Steel around their blast furnace, and you have a large plants which are employing over 3,000 people with have been there nearly 100 years. And you actually need the steel that's made in that technology. So we're going to keep emitting CO2 from those. What we have to do is find a way to capture it and then use it. So we now have a brand new source of carbon that we can then push into a whole range of different industries, like carbonates, like we're working on, into the cement aggregates, rethinking building products, the way we make glass, and into some of the sort of fuels and organics led sort of feedstocks that traditionally have come directly from oils or natural gas.
Well, you've mentioned US Steel. We'll come back to that in a minute. I know we've already talked about the kind of the fact that the reuse market has been somewhat slower to get more mainstream support. We've talked about some of that. I just wondered, are you feeling the difference? Are you seeing the difference in support for this in terms of business development, the pipeline that your team is forging? Does that feel, is there more pace, or is it that deal sizes are improving, or how would you qualify that?
Definitely more pace. We get a lot of inbound interest. I think recognition that people are, what I was saying earlier, people are looking for a portfolio of solutions. So I characterize it, but if you like 2 or 3 years ago, early when I came into this, big companies were out scouting technologies. That was the term that they would use, and they'd be looking at 20, 30 different technologies, trying to find the one. They're not doing that anymore. They're now trying to make, and that of course was just a paralysis by analysis. They were just going around business models and ideas and costings. So they're now looking for a number of technologies and actually actively moving forward. So our model of a first 50,000 ton capture that is commercially viable, makes money, so gives a return on the capital rather than being a pure cost sink, is highly attractive to that make a move stance. The other piece that's starting to pick up with the CCU side is the recognition that the products we make are somebody else's feedstock. So they go into making plastics, they go into making papers, they go into making over-the-counter pharmaceuticals like Tom's and Rennie's. So those companies are all now looking to reduce their carbon footprint. So when they look at their carbon net zero, increasing now, everyone is having to look at counting their scope 3 emissions. So what is coming in? So in the case of their precipitated calcium carbonate that we're making from SkyCycle, it's a very high carbon intensity chemical, and we can replace the existing chemical with a carbon neutral. So all of a sudden, if you can remove hundreds of thousands, if not millions of tons of import CO2 that's embedded in your raw materials by going to a carbon neutral raw material. So the beauty of CCU is it doesn't just help the emitter, it helps the whole carbon value chain. So actually, for every ton that we capture for instance, from a steel flue stack, actually through the displaced calcium carbonate saves 4 tons going to the environment, going out to the atmosphere. So there's a huge beneficial multiplier there.
That's a nice, good juicy stat for a podcast like this. So then let's turn our heads again to that, the collaboration with US Steel. I believe, are you at MOU stage, or is it?
Yeah, and we're in the final sort of drafting of definitive agreements for first plant. Yeah.
Okay. So whatever you can tell us at this stage, what can you tell us about how that's come into being and where you see that heading?
Yeah. So actually, it was something of a sort of tripartite introduction. We've been working with Fluor, the large global EPC contractor, engineering company. They're also large players in the steel industry and building steel plants and elements of the steel process. And they actually introduced us because US Steel was looking for technologies to decarbonize. So that was a nice, it was a nice segue in because it was a sort of, I've spoken on a number of panels recently, is the whole carbon capture is going to work through collaboration. And that was a great example of them advocating our technology, which is great because obviously they're a big player. US Steel was then looking to make that first move. They loved the idea of converting the gases into usable products. So, I mean, one of their C-level guys got very excited with the idea that the blast furnace flue gas could end up in indigestion tablets that you're actually eating. And that's a sort of a nice sweet story just sort of in itself. And this allows them to get moving on with a relatively low to no capital impact. So it's not saying this is a fraction of $1 billion project investment that's going to take the next 6 to 7 years. This can be a very modest investment and is up and running and making money within 2 years. So in the first half still of this decade, we can be capturing CO2 and making a difference, because we've got to start now thinking about those 2030 targets that everybody's got, those interim targets. And for us, getting up a first industrial scale commercial plant up at, we're looking at their site in Gary, Indiana, and then bringing our first carbon neutral PCC to market is going to be a huge milestone for us.
So quite a short time frame that you're able to do from an agreement to delivery.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of work in preparation for this in terms of engineering and project development.
Mm-hmm. One of the kind of slightly more hyper specific or geekier questions that our industrials always like hearing about when we're looking at technologies that are going to be site based like yours is the kind of what's this type of size of space that something like this takes up, because obviously depending on the setup they may have loads of additional real estate, they may not. So how does your technology fit? So
really not that big. You'd be sort of surprised. Something like the USD is great because a lot of these sites are significant brownfield sites, so they actually have a reasonable amount of real estate, and we don't need to be. We literally take the flue gas straight from the base of the chimney, think of it that way. So we can be right next to it, or we can be, up to a mile or so away. So there's a lot of potential to play around with finding the right location on site. One of the things at US Steel we found is that actually we can repurpose some old buildings, actually, because of which actually is there's a sort of an industrial rebirth play that comes with that as well.
Well, let's sort of come back then into CarbonFree itself. So 4 years into your tenure, what is next? What's the kind of stage and phasing of business that you're in, and what's coming next for you and the team?
Yeah, so we've now got we survived through pandemic for that, which is it was always been a challenge for a lot of companies. We've our first generation plant here in San Antonio, we call that Sky Mine as opposed to SkyCycle, is running profitably now. So that's a great place to be, and therefore generating funds to invest back into the broader business. Our first big project, which we anticipate, thinking on with US Steel in the coming few months, we're excited to publish that out. That sets the clock ticking then on our first plant out there, allows us then to introduce our first carbon neutral PCCs out to the market, and we're getting a lot of interest out there as well. And then to start to push out to those other hard-to-abate sectors. We've got a lot of other interest in steel, which we'll want to both in North America and in Europe, into a number of the other hard-to-abate sectors, the cements, the glasses, into some of the other refining and manufacturing spaces. So we've got a good pipeline there that we'll be working on. So we'll be really, the next stage we'll be looking at really plans 2 and 3, and then really aligning the company right from a funding point of view and a resources point of view, to look at really expanding our growth.
Do you have plans for additional funding rounds, or?
One of the natures of this, being a CEO of a company like this, is from literally I was on funding calls for day one that I landed in the job. You're always talking to investors. It's a very active space with the IRA, with the interest in it. You know, a lot of investors are looking at ways that they can invest into this market, and so it's a constant conversation.
I'm sure you know that I'm sure you know that in the UK and Europe, there's been a lot of chat over the last few months about the impact of the IRA and its potential for moving either projects or pilots or
Yeah.
interest. Are you seeing that? I mean, is that a reality, or is it sort of anxiety hype that we Europeans are so good at?
It's interesting. I mean, I think it's a great thing. I mean, I think the feel that the Europeans, to some degree Canadians as well, where we are almost feel a bit snubbed. You know, after particularly maybe a feeling that the US has been dragging its feet for some time. There's almost like there's an affront that they could have maybe sort of leapfrogged over. But that's good competitive pressure. You know, it moves us all to a better place. No, we are seeing some of that. Certainly, a lot of interest in real projects here in the US, not directly related to us, but we've seen certainly manufacturers move projects to the US because of the IRA. Some of that's in more the energy transition space, but even a number of I think there's certainly one large carbon capture company that moved and relocated or was located its European headquarters now in the US. Which, I don't know if that's directly related to that, but it feels like it's part of that same way. So we need the Europeans and Canadians now to retaliate and pull it back, and we'll move as a race to the top is a good one.
No, I think it was interesting how it sort of felt like there was this. So it may even have only been sort of 2 or 3 months ago that I really started sensing the reality of it, but a real shift in gears and sort of a bit of sort of edgy, right, we're going to reclaim this ground.
Exactly.
I mean,
Exactly.
you've got to see it if it delivers, but it
yeah.
certainly feels like it has added a bit of energy back in when it was needed.
I agree.
So as a closeout then, you know, you have a captive audience, some of whom are industrials, some of whom are investors, some of whom are other tech companies, policy influencers, whoever else. What is the call to action, or the kind of the thought that you'd like to leave people with, if you in the context of how, you know, engineering and growing and scaling this CCU market, what would you like to put in front of the audience as a sign off?
I think I mean, my big call to action on carbon capture overall is, you know, get off your backsides and start doing stuff. We've been in a position where we've been talking about this. A lot of great commitments have been made. It's brought a lot of money into the sector. It's brought a lot of technologies and ideas. But corporates need to start making real projects happen. You know, the clock is truly ticking on this. You know, people have made 2030 commitments. They've made big 2050 commitments. We're way behind the curve already, still on those, with there aren't enough projects out there. So make a start, and that's what we believe at CarbonFree. We have a technology that's now ready to go and can be capturing CO2 within 2 years. So get on doing it. Stop worrying and thinking about whether you're doing the right thing or not. Certainly with CCU solutions, those are much lower risk because there is a return on the capital. We're making products which make margins, make revenues. So it's not just a cost only play. I think as you know, there's a theme of this podcast obviously has been about CCU particularly. You know, I think getting a greater acceptance of CCU as a solution because of the bigger multiplier impact it can have. I think starting to, whether regulates the wrong way or certainly incentivize and driving demand for lower carbon products. Ultimately, the consumer is one of the biggest drivers for this. Ultimately, if we want to have products that have green labels on them, have lower carbon intensity products, it will drive back up the supply chain and will require lower carbon products. And that is where CCU can really step in. But for CarbonFree, we're here, we're ready to go today. We have a proven out technology. Yeah, come and talk to us.
Oh, well, it's been really, really great to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much, Martin. And I will keep my BDI on progress with US Steel. We love the team over there and have been fortunate enough to meet them at some of our events as well. So I'll look forward to reading more about the next steps in that project. But again, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Alex. Really appreciate it.
At Jano Media, we recognise that great content has the power to create impactful and positive change for lives and society. Whether that's video, live streams, photography or podcasts, partnering with us will enable you to harness the power of content to engage, inform and inspire. Reach out to us today.